Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, I am joined once again by Dr. Shaun Blanchard. Shaun, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good, buddy. I think
There's a lag?
I think it played twice.
Just a second. Technology, the wonders of technology.
No, it's my fault. It's my fault. We're all good.
Okay.
Good. Because I hit notify and then it popped up. Sorry.
I see. No, you're fine.
Second window open. That shows my age, man.
No, you're fine. I did the same thing the other day, so
Okay.
No worries.
Great.
All right. Well, Shaun, there's so much I'd love to get into today. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you for the audience. And so without further ado, Dr. Shaun Blanchard is a senior research fellow at the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He is the author of The Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II from Oxford University Press. He received his MSc at Oxford University and his PhD at Marquette University. His research lies at the intersection of theology and history and explores the relationship between Catholicism and the Enlightenment, Vatican II, and the history of reform and doctrinal development from the 18th century to the present. Once again, Shaun, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be back.
Wonderful. Well, today, as the audience has noticed on the title of the video, we're going to be talking about the suppression of the Jesuits. Now, this is a very rich and fascinating time period, so there's a lot to talk about, and so we're going to take our time and go through this time period. So I'm going to ask you 5 main questions, Shaun, about the Jesuits, and we're also going to look a little bit at the chronology, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
So, you know what? So, Shaun, if it's okay, do you think I could give you a kind of rundown of how I see the chronology based on our previous discussions and what you
for
sent
sure.
me? Okay, so
Sure.
This is how I see it, and add or correct anything as I go along. So, in the 1600s, there were various ecclesiological and political conflicts, as well as moral ones. There's the whole Gallican Articles that were proclaimed in 1682. There's the Chinese rites and the Malabar rites. There's controversy around those and the original condemnation of Jansenism. So maybe to stop there, this is in the 1600s. There's a lot going on here. Could we maybe open up that era just a little bit more and those specific topics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I would just start by saying by 1600, the Jesuit order is incredibly powerful. They're extremely important to the church's counter-Reformation efforts. They're extremely important to the mission field. They are getting highly intelligent young men to join. They're becoming confessors to really important people, military leaders, political leaders. They're all over Rome. People like Robert Bellarmine are becoming some of the most respected theologians in Catholic Europe. So the Jesuits are a really big deal within, even during Ignatius's lifetime, but certainly by a generation or two after Ignatius's death, they're an extremely important part of the Catholic picture, and especially the Catholic response to Protestantism. And they're very important for restoring a sense of kind of Catholic confidence that the sort of tide of the Reformation can not only be checked, but can actually in some places be reversed. They do become, as we will discuss, very controversial. I mean, they were always controversial for a variety of reasons. One of the controversies that you mentioned is they're going out on the mission field, and they have a reputation maybe in Europe for being quote unquote conservative. And I know these terms are, conservative and progressive applied to people in the 17th century is a little
much different,
tricky, but so they're quite guarded in when they're in Europe, they're quite guarded about any sort of liturgical change. They're actually, in most cases, suspicious of vernacular liturgy. They want people to learn Latin if they're going to read the Bible, or they just want them to be taught by priests about the Bible. But when they're on the mission field, they're incredibly experimental, quote unquote progressive. They're sort of open to these new ideas and new religions. I mean, their intent is to convert non-Catholics to Catholicism without question, but they're willing to see, what is the positive here in this culture or this belief system that we can sort of build on and maybe even learn from. So for that reason, they in the opinion of the Dominicans and in the opinion sometimes of the Franciscan co-missionaries, they go too far with this. So this becomes a massive conflict in China, as in what the Jesuits are doing in China. It's also a conflict in India. So the Malabar Rites is a reference to the kind of what we would now call acculturation that they were doing with Indian religion, culture, society. So eventually, it's a very long story, and I'm not an expert on this part of the story. Eventually, the papacy sides mostly with the anti-Jesuit position. So they put the brakes on most of this kind of liturgical and I suppose theological, cultural experimentation that the Jesuits are doing. So that's an important chapter. We talked about the Gallican articles last time, but talking about that might set the stage for the ecclesiological conflict. And I actually think that these terms are not anachronistic. A lot of times people say, oh, well, ultramontanism, that's really about the 19th century. That, in my opinion, that's not true. At least in the 1700s, I see clear references to ultramontane ideas, people, etc. So anyway, the ultramontane position, which the Jesuits almost uniformly would accept, is really, and there's very practical reasons for this as well as theological. The buck stops with the Pope. That they have a very papal-centric view of the church. They are the sort of foot soldiers of the Pope. The Pope's kind of light brigade, special unit. The Pope loves them. He gives them all kinds of special faculties, special privileges, and they're not really under local episcopal control. They are in certain circumstances, like can they teach at the University of Leuven or something. But when it comes to coming and going, preaching, hearing confessions, they have a level of autonomy that a lot of local bishops don't like. So that's also a contrast. So this is ultramontanism, looking over the mountains to Rome. The contrary position, which is proclaimed in the Gallican articles by an assembly of the French clergy, but it's actually a more widespread position than that. It's called Gallicanism when it's about France, but there's other isms that are sort of similar to this, and conciliarism would be the broadest of them. Episcopalism, conciliarism, something like that. I see.
Yeah.
So I can go over the 4 articles, if that would help.
Well, did we do that last time?
We did.
Okay,
yeah,
so
we did. Maybe we'll
okay, no. So just to summarize real quick what you said, because I think this is excellent for the audience. In other words, you have Gallicanism, so Gaul, France, and then across the Alps is Italy, so ultramontanism over the Alps, and so you have this kind of Vatican I, universal jurisdiction idea floating around. The Jesuits are proponents of this. They're the soldiers of the Pope throughout the world. But then there's in Gallicanism and conciliarism, which is like the umbrella, or what did you say? Episcopalism?
So, Episcopalism would refer to kind of local episcopal authority. So these are both very general terms.
Okay.
So are you focusing on the council or are you focusing on the local bishop? But
gotcha.
They're both anti-ultramontane.
Exactly. Okay, that makes sense. So more autonomy, more subsidiarity is the idea here. And so these are the kind of this is the context here of these disputes. Okay, so that's excellent.
Yep.
Now looking a little bit again at Jansenism. So we talked about the Chinese rites and the Malabar rites and the dispute going on, the Pope coming down on the side of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Now, I just find it so fascinating from everything you're saying, how many things shift all the time, like today compared to back then. But anyway, so Jansenism in 1713 is condemned by Clement IX's papal bull, Unigenitus or Unigenitus. I've heard it different ways, the classical or the ecclesiastical way. And it condemns 101 Jansenist propositions from Pasquier Colonel, right? Or
Cano.
Cano. Okay. So talk a little bit more, if that's okay with you, about Unigenitus and what that did. Yeah.
The Pope was actually Clement XI. The Jansenists loved Clement IX because he's the one that it was the sort of don't ask, don't tell policy. And he was ironically from Pistoia, actually, Clement IX.
Really?
Clement XI was born in the Papal States, but his name was Albani. Apparently, he had Albanian heritage, so he's kind of culturally a kind of interesting man. But so Unigenitus is promulgated in 1713, and that, we talked about this last time, is why it's so important for the Jansenist conflict crisis, which is ripping apart. At that time, it's really ripping apart the French church. There are sort of shockwaves in other places. People know about it. They're debating it, but it's not really threatening to tear ecclesial unity outside of France at this point. And the problem with Unigenitus is that unlike previous condemnations of Jansenism, which really focused mostly on issues about divine grace and free will and a whole kind of very, very technical theological issues, this condemnation had stuff about Bible reading, stuff about liturgy, and most explosively kind of ecclesiological ideas. There's a specific condemnation, which I don't have in front of me, unfortunately, about excommunication and kind of the right, how that works. And it sort of is getting into church government issues that a lot of even anti-Jansenist but not ultramontane folks are really uncomfortable with. So Unigenitus can be seen as a papal blunder insofar as it internationalizes a conflict that really, maybe if the papacy had been more prudent, could have potentially confined to France. The problem is France is really the standard bearer of this alternative ecclesiological vision of Gallicanism. And Italy and Spain are probably the ultramontane heartlands. But in a lot of other places, there is some diversity of thought on these questions. And Unigenitus, I think, is really important to this story of the Jesuits because for two reasons. First is it internationalizes a debate in which the Jesuits are the prime bad guys in the opinions of the people who are being condemned. And the second reason is that the rumor, and I think there's some truth to it, is that Jesuits were really behind this condemnation. So there were a couple really important French Jesuits, and there were Jesuits in the papal court that were telling the Pope, you have to condemn this. This is a pernicious heresy. Also, Louis XIV wanted the condemnation, and he had tremendous influence. So it's not as if other, I mean, Jansenists were quite happy to do back alley deals if it was to their own favor. So it's not as if the Jesuits were kind of uniquely scheming, but they were very powerful and they were very highly placed, and that can make you a lot of enemies. So they became, we were talking off air, they became the king's evil counselors or the Pope's evil counselors. So you could sort of attack the Pope's decision by saying, I respect the successor of Peter, but unfortunately there's these conniving Jesuits behind him pulling the strings. So this becomes an explosive situation.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Let's see. So I find the reign of Pope Benedict XIV. We talked about that last time as well. And so this is from 1740 to 1758. And he is a kind of Irenic. All right, everybody, calm down. Let's everybody talk this through. I'll allow this over here, kind of like with the auxiliaries. You can't call them heretics, modernists, Jansenists. So talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So if we'll stick with the kind of theological debate, purely theological debate about divine grace. So you have, I thought the kind of theologically inclined listeners might be interested in this. So in 1724, the Pope is a Dominican. His name is Benedict the 13th. He's from the Orsini Roman family. And he is he wants to reestablish a kind of papal equilibrium between the schools. Well, he also wants to promote Thomas because he's a Dominican, but he wants to not give the impression that the papacy is siding with Molinism and Jesuits. So he writes a brief, which is kind of like a encyclical, a little bit of a lower level authority called De Missis Precis. So this is in defense of the doctrine of St. Augustine and St. Thomas. So it's basically saying, hey, whatever Unigenitus did, which we stand by because we stand by our predecessors' decisions, whatever it did not condemn Augustine or Thomas. So there's a cool pamphlet that I was reading by a French Dominican in the aftermath of this, and he called it "Thomisme triomphant," triumphant Thomism. So now it's a chance for Dominicans to say, see, the doctrine of the church is actually this. He issues a second brief confirming this. And then you have an era of really interesting theological writing and thinking by Augustinians, especially Italian Augustinians. And Pope Benedict XIV kind of comes out of this school. So what they're trying to do is say, look, Jansenism went too far. Jansenism took a good idea and carried it out of bounds. But Augustine is right. And that doesn't mean you have to be an Augustinian, but if you're differing from Augustine on issues of divine grace, you're probably going wrong. So there's a couple guys that write these very famous works. Fulgencio Balelli, the most famous is probably Gian Lorenzo Berti, who was the general of the Augustinian order. He died in 1766. So Benedict XIV is pro-Augustinian. His perspective is Augustinian, but he recognizes that there's a plurality of schools. He views it as his job is to protect legitimate theological diversity. His good friend Ludovico Muratori very much agrees with this position too. So he would do certain things like there were the Spanish Inquisition, which was different from the Roman Inquisition, for example, condemned a book, as in put it on the index by Enrico Norris, who was Italian but had Irish heritage. He wrote a history of Pelagianism, which was clearly sort of saying, hey, it's not gone. and they fall into it. He wasn't outright accusing Molinists of being Pelagians, but he was very much critiquing the Molinist position. So the Spanish Inquisition banned this book, and Pope Benedict XIV wrote the Inquisitor a private letter and called him Nero. You're this sort of viciously, accusing a good person. And that letter ended up becoming public, which was an embarrassment and all this. But so my point is that Benedict XIV is trying to keep Jansenism is out. He wants to stand by the condemnation of Jansenism. But if you will just accept Unigenitus, and you can explain it in the most Augustinian way you want, but you have to accept the authority of it, all the way to Molinism is not out of bounds either. And even though he doesn't agree with it privately, he wants to respect that there are really good Jesuits doing good work that he wants to work with in as positive a way as he can. So I see him, if I can sort of give my personal opinion, I see Benedict XIV as one of the best popes, certainly in early modernity, and one of my favorite popes. He also had installed a big coffee house in the Vatican, and would have these big sort of coffee fueled parties. So this is this kind of an enlightenment salon where if you drink wine, then you get tired and have to sleep. But if you drink coffee, you can have these spirited intellectual discussions all day. So he had all these hot chocolates and coffees, and he was incredibly affable. He was kind of a bigger guy, very friendly, very cultured. So he's just very easy to like. And then, as we talked about, when he dies, things go downhill pretty quickly. So he was kind of the dad at the Thanksgiving dinner who was keeping the warring uncles, the warring kids from tearing apart the holiday. So
excellent. I always love the family analogies because it really gets to the heart of things when it comes to Catholic history.
I think so, definitely.
So so maybe kind of putting the brakes on right here, because we have the Jesuits, who are, for the most part, if I'm not mistaken, Molinists. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So the Jesuits are the Molinists. You have the Jansenists, which, Rome has said that's a no-go with Unigenitus. Then you have the Augustinians and the Thomists, who are not at all like the Jesuits, but as long as they agree with the authority of Unigenitus, then they're fair game. So maybe just to open up a little bit the theological question, we're talking about grace and free will. And it sounds like the Jansenists were much more in line with what might be considered like a hardline Calvinism, which is you're totally depraved apart from grace. Any kind of human cooperation or synergy is a semi-Pelagian attitude. But the Augustinians are much more open to, like, for example, St. Augustine said, our merits are God's gift, so there's no competition there. Yeah. So before I keep going, could you maybe open up those theological
Sure.
discussions? Yeah.
So, well, the Jansenists would make all kinds of distinctions and say that
Okay.
you're misrepresenting them, but then their opponents would say, no, that's exactly what they think. And here, look, I can prove it. And then they would argue for, years
Yeah.
and years and years. So
Mhm.
what you're saying is the standard critique of Jansenism.
Okay.
What I would respond is that Jansenism, like all these isms, there's lots of different authors and there's lots of different inflections. And I think that they come really, I would say they come very dangerously close on certain questions to what they were accused of. I think they sometimes make very subtle distinctions about, we're not really saying Christ didn't die for everyone, but so basically, just to give an example, a strict Augustinian who is in the good graces of the official magisterium at this time would say, Christ died for everyone, but not all have been given efficacious grace, and why that is a mystery. Whereas what Jansenists were accused, at least, of saying Christ doesn't really die for everyone. He does in this kind of very general sense for the sin of humanity, but really it's the elect. So that's just one example of a kind of the Augustinians, the ones who were in the good graces of the church would follow Augustine, but they would also take the unfolding magisterial teachings as kind of the out of bounds lines. Whereas at this point, Jansenists are just saying Unigenitus is just wrong, and we just need to get rid of it. And there were Augustinians were uncomfortable with Unigenitus. So, for example, they might say something like, these can be interpreted in an orthodox way, but they also have an unorthodox interpretation. This was taken out of context. It's wrong, but when it's put in its context, it can be understood, So just like we do today, honestly, I mean, just like when people, there's not two opinions on Amoris Laetitia or how to interpret that, or there's not two opinions on Dominus Jesus. It's the same thing, but in general, I think what you're saying is right. They were accused of Calvinism. The Jansenists were accused of Calvinism. So they of course published thousands and thousands of pages about why they're not Calvinists. But so
excellent.
Sorry.
Excellent. No worries. Okay, so next, well, before we get to Pope Clement XIII, should I ask you about the moral question about probabilism, or is that after Clement XIII?
I think we just touch on it briefly now.
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah. So, again, to overgeneralize, if there's a kind of tendency towards rigorism, which you get with Jansenists, and there's a kind of tendency towards laxism which you get with Jesuits in general. Now, of course, each side disavows that. Jansenists say, no, we're just saying this is just the practice of the church. Like, occasion of sin is occasion of sin, period. There's no justifying it. And the Jesuits would say, look, we're following our approved confession manuals. We're following probable opinions is what the debate becomes about. So probabilism, there's a great book on this by Stefania Tutino, an Italian historian. I believe she's at UCLA, on the birth of probabilism, the invention of probabilism. And I believe it was actually a Dominican, I believe, named Concina, who's sort of the father of probabilism, but it becomes associated with Jesuits. And it's the idea that when you have a moral conundrum, you can follow a probable opinion. So a probable opinion meaning a kind of approved course of action that you found through some sort of legitimate theological authority. Whereas the Jansenist, or the more rigorous position, is you must always follow the morally safest option. Okay, so the Jansenists would say to a young nobleman, well, can you be at court without participating in corruption or sexual immorality or financial immorality? And if the answer is no, then leave court, because you'll go to hell if you'll sell your soul. Whereas the Jesuits would say, look, we live in France in 1680. People are at court. We are responsible for being their pastors. people have too much to drink. They find themselves in these situations where they're tempted to do a shady deal, or they're sexually tempted, or whatever the thing is. And we have to work with those people where they are. Yeah. So it's conflicting pastoral models, which kind of come to a head explosively. And it involves not just Jansenists and Jesuits. For example, in 1700, the French clergy, the Assembly of the French Clergy, condemn 123 laxist propositions. This is headed by Bishop Bossuet. So you could get a Gallican anti-Jansenist and rigorist, or anti-laxist at least. So there's weird sort of shifting boundaries behind some of this. And I will say a historian who I respect very much, named Jean-Pascal Gay, who's at Louvain, so not old Leuven, but new Louvain in Belgium, has an incredible book called Morals in Conflict. And he believes, and has done way more archival work than I have on this kind of stuff, that in many cases the Jesuits were being sort of treated unfairly. They weren't. They weren't really telling. The Jansenists love spinning these wild accusations. That you could if you got drunk. There's an amazing condemnation in Denzinger saying, if a son gets drunk and kills his father and then rejoices only because he's inheriting money, not because he killed his father, then the rejoicing is not sinful. These are just like completely insane. I used to give these to my students, and we would read them out. It's like just completely nuts, but it could have come from like a failed doctoral dissertation that everyone was like, what the hell is this kid arguing? It wasn't like people in the confessional, like Jesuits in the confessional were saying, well, if you got drunk and then your dad happened to slip, but then when you sobered up, there were abuses going on, as there always are, but I don't think it's fair to paint the Jesuits as these sort of morally bankrupt.
Laxist,
So anyway, that's part of that's a piece of the puzzle here with anti-Jesuitism.
Excellent. I just remember in this area during my moral theology class, St. Alphonsus was brought up as finding a kind of middle ground. What was it? It was like, I can't remember the term for it. It was like
oh gosh, I think it's probabiliorism.
Yeah, something like probable. That. Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah,
it might be Tutiorism. Was it that by any chance?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Alphonsus was very much. A lot of saints are called anti-Jansenists, who it's totally anachronistic. Alphonsus really was dealing with this problem, and his opponents really were Jansenists. So when a priest gives a homily about him combating Jansenism, it's actually true. Whereas when a priest gives a homily about Therese of Lisieux she's combating scruples, it's different,
Yeah.
But no, there was Jansenism in Naples when Alphonsus was around. Yeah.
And it's funny because when you read Alphonsus, I mean, it seems very rigorous, actually.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And there's also the later critique. I think we get this prior to the Second Vatican Council, of this retrieval of teleological ethics as opposed to more deontological. But I think a lot of this dispute is happening almost beside the point. We're forgetting about the kind of reason why morality is meant to lead you to happiness and its purpose.
Right.
Okay.
That's
I just find all that interesting how it fits in.
Yeah. Yep. No question. No, this debate, because you can draw a line from Alphonsus in the 19th century. Alphonsus is put forward as the good middle road. This is the way to go to avoid the kind of Scylla and Charybdis of too lax or Jansenist. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's this pro-Jesuit pope called Clement XIII. He reigns from 1758 to 1769. Now he's the successor to good old Benedict XIV.
Yep.
Now, what's this pope like?
Yeah, so his name is Rezzonico, Carlo Rezzonico. He's from Venice. And the Catholic powers, so at this time, the Catholic countries were very much involved in papal elections, and they would put tremendous pressure on the College of Cardinals, sometimes with vetoes. It wasn't until 1903 Pope Pius X abolished the veto. So Clement XIII is seen as a at least potentially acceptable candidate by the great Catholic powers. Austria and France were working to prevent the election of a pro-Jesuit pope. And I don't know, they didn't get there. It was like when McCain vetted Palin incorrectly or something. I don't know. They didn't get the right, the right info. Clement XIII gets elected, and he is sick of what he sees as the papacy getting pushed around by the Catholic powers. He has a very high view of papal authority. Benedict XIV had a very high view of theoretical papal authority. He was just incredibly sort of pragmatic. I mean, all popes maintain the ultramontane position.
They have to
by default, right?
And
but some of them are very, very sort of moderate and practical. What's the best that can be done in the situation? Others, it's full steam ahead. Submit to Peter, that kind of thing. So Clement XIII was not very politically savvy in many ways. He appointed a Secretary of State, which second in command, really important position, named Torrigiani, who was very much pro-Jesuit. So he immediately, so this is like 1758, 1759. You get a groups that we could call philo-Jansenists, so kind of Jansenist favorers, sympathizers who basically are like, okay, like this is war, this is a battle, and they really start conspiring for the destruction of the Jesuit order. So it's a kind of true conspiracy theory. There's a great book on this by Dale Van Clay called Reformed Catholicism and the International Suppression of the Jesuits. It came out a couple years ago. So there's very clear archival evidence that during the reign of Clement XIII, so this period of 1760s, you have this kind of international network, and the theological motivation is about Unigenitus. It's if we can get rid of the Jesuits, then we can get a pope who will essentially either formally overturn Unigenitus. I don't know how they would have thought that could happen. It's kind of like what Vigano says with Vatican II. It's like, what mechanism are you thinking? But they had a backup plan that is amazing to read. It's fascinating. They drafted a bull called Aspicientes, hoping, and it's essentially a repudiation of Unigenitus. I mean, it's essentially saying the Augustinian position is this, and which maybe a lot of the Augustinians could sign on to, but the people behind this meant it as this is it. Now orthodoxy is Augustinianism, not Molinism. So anyway, Clement XIII alienates a lot of people, and I guess if we just kind of went through the timeline here. So in 1759, the Kingdom of Portugal and its empire, which at this time is large, expels the Jesuits. So they're not Jesuits. They're not allowed in Portuguese territory. So if you've seen the film The Mission is a really beautiful film. I think that's a little bit later, but I believe it's supposed to be a little bit later, but they're dealing with this really sad story of the Jesuit reductions being basically taken over by these imperial powers. The reductions weren't perfect, but they were a real attempt by the Jesuits to kind of respect indigenous ways of life, at least to a certain degree. And the imperial powers, just steamrolled this. So they're 1759, Portugal expels them. The papacy is furious, obviously. 1764, the Kingdom of France dissolves the Jesuit order in France. So that means if you're a French priest, if you're a French Jesuit, you cease to be a Jesuit. There is no Jesuit order recognized legally in France in 1763.
These are the secular, quote unquote, parliaments of France.
The parliaments,
saying
that's right.
Goodbye, Jesuits.
Yeah, I think they had to get the king. They basically coerced the king. France wasn't quite as absolutist as people make it out to be. The king did have. It was a touch and go situation at times for the king.
Gotcha.
You could be in kind of financial trouble, or your political capital, because he would get furious and sort of dissolve the parliaments and send them home. But then he can't govern. So at some point he has to. It's like if Biden could dissolve Congress, it's like, okay, but you can sign
Now
executive
what?
orders, but
Yeah.
then, so anyway, the parlements, the king does not want to get rid of the Jesuits. He sees the Jesuits as great educators and anti-Jansenist. And, they were close. The Jesuits tended to be close to the crown. There was a strong tradition of having Jesuit, spiritual directors, confessors. So the crown, ironically, the French crown is not anti-Jesuit, but the parlements are ruthlessly anti-Jesuit.
That is very ironic, because Gallicanism really
exactly.
it kind of comes out of the kind of what's his name, Boniface VIII, saying to
Yeah.
Philip IV, no, I have this spiritual universal authority. It's not the French church versus the Italian church. It's the Catholic church. So that is ironic. Yeah.
It's a weird situation in France, and it's because of Jansenism and Unigenitus. And it's the political problem. But yeah, so you have their Gallican. I mean, the crown is Gallican in a very obvious sense, the same way the Pope's always ultramontane.
Right.
But when it comes to these church politics things, they're very Gallican when it comes to like money and appointing bishops. But they really want to be on side with the papacy, certainly theologically, because they want their own authority, which was like kind of quasi-apostolic in the French mind. Their own authority is backed up by Rome, where the eldest daughter of the church were in communion with Rome. So you actually get, in some cases, you get Portuguese and Spanish crown personnel that are more antagonistic to the Pope than the French king, which is weird because Spain, of course, was the kind of hotbed of ultramontanism. So anyway, it's a time of political kind of shifting sands.
Gotcha.
1767, so a couple years later, the Jesuits are expelled from Naples and from Spain and the Spanish Empire. So we're now talking about the Spanish Empire, of course, is vast, Mexico, parts of South America. Naples is the Kingdom of Naples, which is large and wealthy. And I believe the King of Naples becomes the King of Spain. So Charles III of Naples becomes Charles III of Spain. So it's in the family. It's a dependency, I suppose, of the Spanish crown. So at this point, things are looking really, really bad for the Jesuits. And I suppose now we could talk about the Parma incident.
Yeah. So this is throughout the reign of Clement XIII. Again, for the audience, who succeeds Benedict XIV in his peaceful policy. So we have 1759, Jesuits they're expelled from Portugal and its empire.
Right.
1764, France, by the parliaments. 1767, Naples. Now, the Parma disaster. So let's go ahead and tackle that. Yeah.
Naples, Spain, and the Spanish Empire. Yeah.
Spain as well. Okay.
Parma, what is it? The Duke of Parma is the nephew of the King of Spain. Okay, so this is the Bourbon family. Okay, so the Bourbon family, like Bourbon Street in New Orleans, actually is named for, because the House of Bourbon was the kings of Spain and France at this time. Is all the same family. They're branches of the family, I should say. So Parma is a small Italian city-state. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, but it's not particularly politically important, certainly not like Spain or Naples or something like that. But the nephew of the King of Spain, Ferdinando I, he basically tries to assert the kind of ecclesial political independence that his uncle and the other leading members of his family have asserted. So he issues something called the Pragmatic Sanction in January of 1768. So it does lots of things. One of the most important requires the exequatur. Exequatur is like a let it be carried out, let it be executed. So when the Pope would send like a papal bull to France, it had to receive this kind of royal imprimatur in order to be printed and diffused. And actually the parliaments would investigate it and all that sort of thing. Parma wasn't doing this. They presumably, because of their history with the papacy, they had a more open geographically and ties actually with the papal states. So Ferdinando is trying to assert this basically wall between his own authority and papal authority. So Clement XIII is enraged by this because he's seen the domino after domino is sort of falling against him. So he, does what he thinks popes ought to do in this scenario. And he, in the words of Dale Van Clay, spectacularly anachronistic anathemas. Okay. So he's thinking about kind of the what is the, what did we say last time? There's a distinction between power and authority.
Authority,
right?
yeah, or
So
dignity and being efficacious.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like he has the authority, according to the ultramontane understanding of papal authority, he has every right to do this. But then there's like, what happens when you do this?
And how do you do it? Yeah.
So Benedict XIV believed he had the right to do this kind of stuff. He just didn't do it. So what he would have done, probably back channel diplomacy, invite the young Duke to the coffee house, talk about the great relationship between Rome and Parma, some sort of face-saving measure, maybe money exchanges hands. I don't mean like bribes. I just mean like
gifts.
These revenues go here and these revenues go here. Is that acceptable, Your Majesty? I really want to maintain good relations. That's how Benedict XIV kept the ship afloat. Clement XIII is a bull in the china shop. So he excommunicates the Duke, the Bourbon Duke Ferdinando, and he excommunicates all of his collaborators, which could be interpreted loosely or broadly. So the Bourbon, the big guys in the family, decide to interpret this broadly, and they claim this is an attack on the entire House of Bourbon. So they're furious, and they actually, French and Neapolitan troops actually start occupying papal territories. So this is a disaster for the papacy, and Clement has to back down. So this is kind of it's an unstable situation, and I think for the papacy it was like losing Parma, when even this tiny Italian city-state that we've had good relations with for so long, when even they are turning against us, it was like a kind of act of desperation with their back against the wall. So Clement dies a couple years later. He dies in 1769, and that year the Jesuits are also expelled from Malta, and Malta is traditionally, very, very
Catholic,
very Catholic, very traditional, very pious, anti-Protestant. So this is starting to look really, really bad for the kind of pro-Jesuit folks, which include the papacy.
Yeah. And so this is where we get to the reign of Pope Clement XIV. And he reigns from 1769, when the Jesuits are expelled from Malta, and Clement XIII dies, all the way to 1774. And so it's this Pope that suppresses the Jesuits. So let's open up his reign.
That's right. So he is a Franciscan. His name's Lorenzo Ganganelli. Very, very intelligent man, interesting guy, kind of a idiosyncratic in certain ways. And during the conclave, or before the conclave, the Catholic powers are trying to sort of deal the death blow to the Jesuits. The only place that wasn't pushing for this, of note, as far as I know, was Austria. The Habsburgs were moving in a kind of philo-Jansenist direction as far as the professors they were appointing and the confessors and things like that at court. But they weren't, if I recall correctly, they weren't pushing for they were uncomfortable with how extreme this had gotten, and they hadn't expelled the Jesuits or dissolved them or anything like that. But pretty much everyone else is antagonistic at this point. Even though, as we said, the King of France is not wanting to go along with the suppression. So they elect Ganganelli. Apparently, he was asked before the conclave whether the Pope had the right to dissolve the Jesuit order. And this is an interesting question, because one understanding of infallibility, it's not a way we would recognize it today, but one understanding was kind of precedent, like case precedent, if you will. So the term infallibility, I think there's a concept of it that's patristic, at least of the judgment of the church, the Pope as the Pope Leo I, that kind of deal. But the actual debate, the term entering Catholic parlance is late medieval, and it's a Franciscan challenging the papacy, saying you can't abolish certain parts of the Franciscan constitution because your predecessor approved of it. And your predecessor, you can't undo your predecessor. Okay. So there's this question, can the Pope do it? Which some desperate supporters of the Jesuits are saying you can't, because your predecessors have said over and over and over again, this is good, this is holy, this is for the good of the church. It's kind of like people argue today about like popes changing liturgical discipline.
At the
because there's something in Auctorum Fide. There's quo primum, absolutely. So quo primum, that's mostly extreme traditionalist, but it is interesting. I mean, when you look at the phrasing, he doesn't seem to be saying, I mean, he's my supreme apostolic authority, all that. So Auctorum Fide, which condemns the Synod of Pistoia, has a line about something about changing discipline that is very controversial. It's it's a lower censure. It's not a censure of heretical. It's a censure of like erroneous and impious or something like that. So
I think
anyway, go ahead.
Kind of sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, Ratzinger kind of gets into this about. He doesn't say that like the Pope can't do something. I mean, this is in the Catechism as well. He talks about the Pope's duty as the servant of servants, and how he can't do certain things when it comes to, in the sense of he shouldn't, right? Morality. He's held to serve, not to dictate in a tyrannical way. That being said, though, because of the constitution of the church, if something is disciplinary and he does make that decision, whether he should have or not, this is the way I understand it currently, right? Is not the point, is whether we have the if we are allowed to resist that, so anyway, so I think Ratzinger strikes that balance of like, this is the constitution of the church, but no, the Pope should be the servant of servants, etc.
Yes. Okay. Definitely. I mean, certainly the vision of Vatican I is almost unlimited. The limit is in the Pope's conscience and in his relationship with God and stuff like that. And I do think that can be questioned. So as I said last time, I think the traditionalists are asking good questions about a lot of this stuff about, well, hold on, how far does this go, under what that's a good question to ask. I don't think many of them are answering the question in the best way. And I think you can be inflammatory when you don't have to be inflammatory and all that. Kind of stuff.
And I agree. It's like because I mean, as you're walking us through this history, you do see these emphases and these popes like Benedict XIV or like Clement XIII, and it's like these are all good and fair questions, but again, I think it comes down to the critical spirit versus constructive criticism.
Absolutely, totally. And in what spirit are you questioning something? And in what spirit? And if you were to disobey a superior, Congar talks a lot about this. Is it because the superior is asking you to sin, or is it because you're furious that your own idea has kind of lost the debate? And that's difficult, as I think Congar really challengingly and beautifully explores in his writing. So they asked the question clearly. Yes, the Pope had, the Pope could confirm orders and the Pope could abolish orders, as in religious orders, religious societies. Then the second question that he was asked was, does any current prudential judgment, maybe is the phrase we always use now, does any current circumstance or issue prevent a Pope now from making that judgment? And he said no. Okay. So
I've been set up. I'm
sure these questions were asked very widely there were these things called crown cardinals, where I see. They would say, well, we need to give the Habsburgs have to have the Archbishop of Vienna made a cardinal because he would represent their interests in Rome, especially during a conclave. Because the point that they're trying to do is, before Vatican I, before the 19th century, they want a papal election that is going to work for the whole Catholic world and function smoothly. That's what everyone wants. I mean, you want your guy, but you don't want broken diplomatic relations, financial disputes, delayed. It could be super pragmatic, like we need marriage dispensations. This second cousin who's the daughter of the Duke of whoever needs to marry this, and you have to get that dispensation from Rome. And if diplomatic relations are broken, as they were at one point between Portugal and Rome. There's a huge problem filling vacant bishoprics, because so the King of France could appoint a bishop, but the Pope could veto that. And so anyway, they want it to work. So they elect Ganganelli with the understanding that he's going to suppress the Jesuits. He delays as long as he possibly can. So he becomes Pope in 1769. He dies in 1774, and he only suppresses the Jesuits in July of 1773. So finally, he's completely cornered. His back is against the wall. He has no more excuses, and he issues a brief called Dominus Ac Redemptor, which dissolves the Jesuit order. So they cease to exist, at least in the eyes of the papacy. There's an interesting, what that does in practice is the Austria, the Habsburg lands, the German lands, and the Italian states, they receive the bull. The Jesuits are gone, in theory.
Gotcha.
The funny thing is, they survive. This is ironic for the anti-Protestant or counter-Reformation ultramontane champions. They survive in Protestant Prussia, that relatively new northern German state, under Frederick the Great, who just thinks they're smart. He just likes them. There's no interest in, he's a sort of skeptic. Yeah. He's a sort of cultural Protestant, privately kind of, or not even privately, he's a skeptic. But he just thinks they're smart. They're into astronomy. They love music. They know ancient Greek. I just kind of like having them around.
Yeah.
It wasn't that flippant. They were put to work, but he just thought they were smart and interesting. And then also in Orthodox Russia under Catherine the Great, who just thought, these intelligent, fascinating men that make my lands look more sophisticated. So the irony is the Jesuits didn't completely go away or cease to exist. It's just that Catherine the Great, doesn't recognize papal authority in any measure whatsoever. So they were fine. So that's the end of the run of them. So they de facto cease to exist for about 40 years, and then they're restored in 1814 in a dramatically different European Catholic world order context by Pope Pius VII. So that's the restoration of the Jesuits, is the papacy surviving this wave after wave after wave, Jansenism, Catholic Enlightenment, Gallicanism, and then sort of emerges somehow the last man standing. All the pieces of the chess table are thrown off by the French Revolution. And the papacy is the last man standing, so they get to resurrect their favorite guys. Yeah,
excellent. That's fascinating to me. So 1773, Dominus Ac Redemptor by Clement XIV suppresses the Jesuits officially. As you said, they survive in Orthodox Russia and in Prussia, Protestant Prussia. Now, I find that fascinating. You said, once all of the chess pieces are swiped away, the one man standing is still there, and then he brings them back. 1814, Pope Pius VII brings them back. I find that interesting because it shows you how the Catholic Church survives crazy things, right? It's got this, because you brought this up. I think this was when we talked privately. And I think a lot of the reformers at the Second Vatican Council emphasized this. The Church is not a mere organization, it's an organism, right? It's the body of Christ.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there really is this kind of malleability which maintains its essence, because if it doesn't, then it's there, you can't really speak of change if there's no identity, And so I find it interesting that you have this kind of wellspring of tradition, like a toolbox, and the papacy is taking these tools or acquiescing to certain pressures. But in so doing, it survives chaotic times. I find that really interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. In some ways, it's the most traditional, most conservative of authorities. But in the other way, on the other hand, the papacy is remarkably adaptable, and has almost this deeply what's the right way to phrase this? There's this like deeply internalized ability to change. Actually, with continuity, of course, the papacy is. I mean, you see it when you walk into St. Peter's, how interested the papacy is in continuity. with the images
Yes.
of Peter, images of Christ, images of Constantine. You know, you walk into the main hall and you look to the right and the left. I believe it's Constantine and Charlemagne. It might be Constantine and Theodosius, but there's this clear sort of in-your-face statement of, if you're wondering who goes back to the very beginning, it's us. It's not the Archbishop of Vienna. It's not the Dominican order or whatever. So the papacy is remarkable at changing in order to stay the same, I suppose, as much as it can. So the papacy adapts to this new globalized world in a really remarkable way. Not all of this is good, by the way. There's good and bad, I think. You know,
I would agree. Yeah.
You know, there's progress and backsliding, and there's sin mixed up in all this. But as an organism, as you say, it's a remarkable historical story.
And I also love the again, the reformers of the Second Vatican Council talk about the kind of the Marian charism as well as the Petrine structure. So in the heart, the beating heart of the church is that Marian, charismatic, not in the sense of kumbaya, but that Marian charism. But you need that. So okay, the way I put it to some friends of mine is, you take a picture of the Holy Family. What do you have? You have the woman, Mary, Israel, the church, and in her midst, on her lap or in her womb, you have the Word made flesh. So Word and sacraments, right?
Mediating the Word.
Yes, exactly. And then by her side, what do you have? You have Saint Joseph with a staff that it has the lilies that blossom. Lilies meaning purity, staff meaning authority. Him protecting the woman with the Word in her midst, and it's like that's the bishop, or that's the Petrine structure. And so to me, the Holy Family is on its way to Egypt and back, right? On the donkey, this pilgrim people. It represents the church in these shifting sands.
Absolutely. So I think that's a really beautiful. I haven't thought of it that way as the Holy Family as such, and that's a beautiful image, I think.
Okay, so let's see, a few more things I wanted to ask you about. This is, I know, a big topic, but the intellectual and educational questions of Catholic Enlightenment. In an article that you sent me, you speak of 3 different waves of Catholic Enlightenment. As someone who's new to this, what in the world is Catholic Enlightenment?
Great question, because Catholicism and Enlightenment were seen to be incompatible. I mean, from the general opinion for most of the 1800s and probably the first half of the 1900s is you have a kind of Catholic modernization, but it's not Enlightenment, and they're really antagonistic to one another. And that picture has began to be challenged. Well, let me say, first of all, that is a 19th century construction. Okay, so people in the 1800s, whether they were Catholics that were anti-Enlightenment, counter-revolution, counter-Enlightenment, or whether they were secularizing or Protestant Enlighteners or pro-Enlightenment people, constructed a history. I don't mean they were deliberately falsifying anything, but it was a historical narrative that was constructed after the fact. It's not an 18th century narrative, or you see the beginnings of it then. Anyway, in the early 1900s, in 1908, I believe, 1908, a German church historian named Sebastian Markel gave an address in Berlin on Catholic Enlightenment, Katholische Aufklärung. And he essentially argued that there was a sort of positive interaction between Catholic bishops, Catholic intellectuals, Catholic statesmen, with new methods of learning, new methods of thinking, but their goal was to essentially preserve Catholic belief in revelation. Okay, so if there's another, my mentor is a German church historian named Ulrich Lehner, who's done, I don't think I'm biased when I say he's done some of the most important work, especially in English, on Catholic Enlightenment. There's an older German historian named Harm Klutin, who is a Catholic priest, a convert from Lutheranism, and he has an excellent book called I'll say the title in English, Catholic Enlightenment or Enlightenment in Catholic Lands. Okay. So his point with this, it's a helpful thing, is there was Catholic Enlightenment in Austria, in the Italian states, in France, really throughout Europe. There was also Enlightenment in Catholic countries. So there were people in Catholic countries who were secular enlighteners, or who had no interest in defending revelation per se. But there were people who were using new historical critical methods, or using Newtonianism, Newtonian physics, Wolffian metaphysics. So they were adjusting scholasticism or even rejecting scholasticism. So I think now, I mean, Markle was very controversial in his day. This is right in the middle of the modernist crisis. But since the 60s and 70s, and increasingly in the last couple of decades, that there was a positive relationship between religion and enlightenment, and Catholicism and enlightenment, I think would be granted by almost everybody now. Yeah. How exactly you talk about it, is it Enlightenment Catholicism? Is it Catholic Enlightenment? That's terminological debate. Is that making sense?
It does, and it seems to me that this 19th century myth that is at the root of a lot of faith versus reason, and the kind of a kind of secular atheism and materialism. I mean, it was already in the works, but a lot of the nuns, the breakdown of religion, and even a redefining of what religion is.
Yeah,
I think a lot of this is when we start to concede these breaks and these divisions, it's counterproductive, I think.
Absolutely.
And so
you're a big Ratzinger guy, and Ratzinger, I just wrote a long essay on Catholic Enlightenment, and the last person I cite is Ratzinger, because I think Ratzinger is. Anyway, I'll send you the essay. I don't want to go off on a long tangent about Ratzinger, but Ratzinger is taking very seriously the questions and problems raised by the Age of Enlightenment, and he knows that they can't simply be you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can deal with it in a constructive Christian way, but you can't ignore it. So I wouldn't say he's like a Catholic enlightener. He's born in the 1920s, but on the way he deals with religious liberty, the way he deals with questions of faith and reason. If you look at who John Paul II cites in Fides et Ratio, it's very much it's a very eclectic, very pluralistic view of people who have arrived at truth, or asking the right questions, or at least seeking truth. It's not this kind of linear, and there is darkness outside, and we have preserved this scholastic, he loves Thomas, he loves the scholastic tradition, but it's very eclectic. And in that sense, I think it's a kind of, what's the right word? What's the opposite of repudiation? My brain's stopping to work. It's a kind of post facto. It's a harmonization with Catholic Enlightenment ideals, I think.
I think you see this very well in Pope Benedict's method C of exegesis, where he, of course, takes for granted the patristics, but he also wants to incorporate historical critical Enlightenment thought, but he wants to criticize the criticism. So he's using an Enlightenment concept to criticize the Enlightenment, and therefore to harmonize it and bring it into this new method, not A or B, but C now. And I think that's, again, an example of change that maintains continuity and identity, and yet that survives, as history goes on. So I think it's just brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. It's neither with Ratzinger, it's neither radical German historical criticism, nor is it kind of anti-modernism that just says, don't ask those questions. This is the narrative, and if you look at the anti-modernist stuff on biblical criticism, and then you look at the radical German critical stuff, and then you read Ratzinger, I think it's like, as you say, not A, not B, but C. So that's a good example. So Catholic Enlighteners, the best of the Catholic Enlightenment tradition, like all traditions, it's got good and bad. The best of it is trying to do that. So Ludovico Muratori and Pope Benedict the 14th. And I know Pope Benedict the 16th wasn't thinking of Pope Benedict the 14th, but I kind of think it's kind of a nice synergy that we have that. And then, but I'll just say very briefly with what I conceive of. I've written a couple things recently. trying to clear up this terminological confusion, because some people, when they mean Catholic Enlightenment, they mean like really aggressive stuff happening in Austria right before the French Revolution, or they might mean, no, it's actually this very broad concept. It's Jesuit scientists, it's Oratorian biblical scholars, it's nuns who are doing educational reform in Germany. It's all these things. And so basically I say all have won and all shall have prizes, to quote Alice in Wonderland. So all of these things, if you just distinguish what you mean. So the first stream I call first stream Catholic Enlightenment is this very broad conception. It could be a Jansenist or a Jesuit. It could be a woman religious. It could be, but anyone who is engaging with new methods of learning with the goal of reforming church or society, or both. So, for example, Pope Benedict XIV actually appointed 2 Italian women to university chairs in the middle of the 1700s. Totally radical. Yeah. I mean, think about, when did women start going to college? When did we have male female colleges in the United States? 1910s, 1920s, something like that. Yeah. So, he appointed 2 women as professors at the University of Bologna, and they were doing this incredible, one was an anatomist and one was a mathematician. So that's at its broadest level, Catholic engagement with the new learning. Gotcha. The second stream is Ludovico Muratori style religious reform. So it's defending revelation, but criticizing superstition, or criticizing bigotry, or trying to reform the missal to get rid of legends, unhistorical, unverifiable things. And this is where it gets tricky, because 2 people can agree but have completely different reasons for why they agree with it. So Voltaire could say, oh yeah, get that story of St. Christopher out of the missal, because he just thinks religion is sort of, I mean, he doesn't completely reject religion, but he doesn't really believe in revelation in the way that a Catholic does. Yeah. It's a more of a kind of
humanism, maybe.
Yeah, he wasn't an atheist, but it's a kind of Christian humanism that sort of de-supernaturalize. Ludovico Muratori, on the other hand, was not at all profound believer in the Trinity, the Incarnation, the real presence. But he also said, look, the documents that we look at suggest this person did not live in this place at that time. So we need to correct the reading that we're doing. And when it says this, we know that's wrong, and we have to correct it. We have to admit we're wrong and change it, and history is part of God's revelation. God gave us reason. So that's the second stream Catholic Enlightenment. And at times it could really offend popular piety, because most people are illiterate. So you tell them, hey, these stones, there was one situation where a French bishop, I can't remember what diocese, the local belief was that there were stones in the cathedral that had been used to stone St. Stephen. And the bishop said, I'm sorry, there's, the first time this pops up is 1057 AD. And, I don't think we should be venerating these stones. We don't know where they come from. And then the people threatened to stone him, because for them, that was what they couldn't read a missal. They couldn't read the Bible. They're illiterate, and this was a special thing for their town. So you had to be very careful how you did this.
Wasn't there one about the umbilical cord of Jesus?
Oh yeah. You get all these. I don't know exactly where. I have heard of that. I can't recall exactly where, but the one that so Scipione de' Ricci, the Bishop of Pistoia, I think we talked about this last time. So the cherished local relic was Our Lady's girdle, that allegedly, as she was being assumed into heaven, she threw it to St. Thomas, and he caught it. And it ended up, it conveniently ended up in Italy, where all these things end up, So Ricci actually was kind of careful. The people knew that he didn't like it and that he didn't think it was real, but it's unclear, as far as I can tell in the archive, it was unclear what he actually, I don't know that he actually tried to remove it. I think they just thought he was going to. They were fed up with him, and they were fed up with the Synod of Pistoia, and they rioted. I think we talked about this last time. They ripped out his episcopal chair and burned it in the square. They drank all his wine, and the Grand Duke had to send troops to restore order. So my point is, you can criticize on good historical grounds or good theological grounds, but you had to be really, really careful. That's second stream.
Okay.
Finally, third stream is when all this comes together. You have really these forces that we're talking about in the suppression of the Jesuits. So you have these kinds of states that are asserting control over the church in all non-theological matters, strictly understood. That's sometimes called Erastianism or regalism, in the sense of the king, the crownism, regalism. So when this comes together, you have like lots of monasteries getting dissolved. So if the monks aren't also teaching, then they would, Joseph II in Austria dissolved hundreds of monasteries, and some of them probably did need to be dissolved. And there were problems. There were parish priests that were not paid and were not educated, and he diverted a ton of money. There were some kind of fat cat monasteries, and a lot of that was diverted towards parish priests who actually needed it to live. But he went really, 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 really far, and it was a kind of view of religion as, if it isn't useful, then if it's not useful for society in a very tangible way, then there's no point to it. You can be a religious believer and think that, but you can also be a skeptic who doesn't publicize that they're a skeptic, but gets on that train and never gets off. So the third wave of Catholic Enlightenment had some good ideas and did some good things, but it also, I think, in many cases was way too aggressive, fiercely anti-papal, anti-monastic, and the polemic against superstition would really get to the point of kind of ruining a lot of what was beautiful and sort of colorful and wonderful about Catholicism. So that's certainly my wife's opinion. Whenever we travel these places and I explain what these people, she goes, "Why do you these people sound horrible? Why do you study these horrible killjoys?" So that's my thing with Catholic Enlightenment. I think you can go stream 1, stream 2, stream 3, and then people don't need to argue as much about this is Catholic Enlightenment. It's just all of these things are, and you just have to distinguish.
Yeah.
Just like we would say, like, what's humanism?
Right.
What is Counter-Reformation Catholicism? Well, where, when, what religious order? Same type of deal.
Yeah, and another thing that Ratzinger brings up is that, because he's all for reform and a kind of more progressive, positive theology. Progressive being used here, not in a bad way.
Right. Yeah.
But I think later on he even said that he was getting fed up with people who were actually attacking the piety of lay Catholics. And he's like, look, you can only take this so far. I know at a certain point, you're just you're undermining the simple faith of Orthodox lay people.
Right.
And I think that is an extreme that is, especially when you get more into the ivory tower, you can tend to be a little more cynical, I think. And that's been my experience. And I've been kind of regrounded by some friends who are like, you think everything's a legend. Like, okay, fair enough. Anyway.
Well, also, I think there's a realization that we have now that they didn't have so much in that day. They were, I think we start seeing in the 16th century, or probably the 15th, with humanism, a historical awareness, an awareness that things in the past were different and maybe radically different than they are today. And I heard an art historian once say something that like had hid in plain view to me. You know how you'll see paintings where like, say like a medieval Spanish painting of Jesus, of like something with the Passion, and the soldiers will be wearing like contemporary outfits. They just look like Spanish soldiers. And it's like, well, I guess that's kind of cool because it's kind of like this sort of like
talking to us today,
enculturation or whatever. But the art historian, and I wish I knew more about this, but if I'm remembering correctly, the art historian said, well, that wasn't really a problem for them. They didn't really think about that. Really? And you can notice a shift when they start trying to portray historical topics historically with a real awareness of people are dressing differently, society is different. And anyway, so there's a historical awareness that develops humanism. You start having text critical study. Okay, the donation of Constantine is fake, that kind of stuff. And then you get with Ratzinger, now when you get that much later in history, there's actually a historical consciousness. And I think a lot of what's going on at Vatican II is really a battle over, we don't want to be modernists, but we also have to accept historical consciousness in some form. Young Ratzingers, young Karl Rahner, all these people, Congar. So I think that's part of the issue here too, is to look at a relic and say, okay, this is so important to the Spanish people or the Filipinos or the Guatemalan people or whatever group venerates this, and that makes it religiously relevant.
Yeah.
And that's the Tridentine reformers, I think, really were thinking, let's figure out what's real and what's not real.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think later on there's a kind of, well,
let's be real.
yeah. And like, is this something that is drawing people closer to God? Is this something that is, the way to do it? Is this financially exploitative? Is this giving people some sort of bad theological idea? And if it isn't doing those things, I think most Catholic leaders started saying, hey, let's pump the brakes on,
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of sacramental intention. There's certain things you just can't know, and God provides His grace.
For sure.
Yeah, because we can't know. Maybe it is
these tools, these historical tools themselves develop. In 100 years, there's going to be some things where they go, can you believe that in 2022 people thought X, Y, Z?
Yeah.
And now we know clearly, so there you also have to accept a limit of historical, and Congar is great about this. The Jansenists were horrible about this. The Jansenists believed they had direct on tap, this is the patristic position, or this is what this text says. And that can, if you don't have a bit of humility and critical distance, you can get in bad places.
Yeah. Okay. If you have to go at any time, let me know. I don't want to keep you too long, but we have a few questions in the chat, but I also had a couple thoughts here that I wanted to get some feedback from you.
Yeah, sure.
We talked about Gallicanism and Ultramontanism. We talked about Molinism and Jansenism. We talked about Unigenitus and the Augustinians. The list goes on. We talk about these different positions, and we also see how they're shifting back and forth. What comes to mind is John Henry Newman, right? The development of doctrine, his imagery of the organism. And specifically, recently I had an interview with Dr. Keith Lemna on Louis Bouillet. And Bouillet was extremely influential at the Second Vatican Council, and also he was he loved John Henry Newman very much, his theology, his writings. He wrote a biography of him, etc., etc. Newman is one of the reasons why he became Catholic, Louis Bouillet. And he wrote this book called the Spirit and Forms of Protestantism. And he gives both a critique and an appraisal of certain aspects. And the fact that Bouillet was so influential at the council, it seems to me to show, in light of Newman, in light of the Reformation, in light of all these things that we just talked about, that the Catholic Church is able to look at her past, to take what's good and what's practical for today in a way that is, maintains that continuity and yet looks very new. And so I guess it's more of a thought I'm verbalizing, but I think that this is also a reason why we have such strong reactions against the council, because there is a lot of very new things. It is a reform. There is a kind of discontinuity because we are accepting certain things that seemed to have been condemned. But again, it's like with Protestantism, when we taking Protestant thought back in, we're taking it without the negative stuff that Bouillet would have talked about, for example. Does what I'm saying make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know Bouillet's work that well. I've read a couple.
Yeah.
He has some amazing articles, journal articles. And I've met Lemna, and I know that his work on Bouillet is excellent. I haven't read it myself, but I think what you're describing sounds like the kind of ressourcement vision that these guys were really going for. And I mean, executing it is harder than envisioning it or writing about it. But that's the Second Vatican Council, especially as it developed along its kind of ecumenical path. There's these amazing articles by Jared Wicks. I don't know if you've come across Wicks.
I don't think so.
Elder, he may have passed. He's a Jesuit theologian, church historian, who I believe was at he was at the seminary in Cincinnati at the end of his life. Anyway, Jared Wicks has these amazing articles about what was going on during the council and how this, what he calls the ecumenical turn. And it's absolutely the way that the council fathers are engaging with Protestantism is not a repudiation of any Catholic truth. And I would very staunchly hold that against a Catholic critic of the council or against a Protestant or some other person who held the opposite view. Nevertheless, it is, as you articulated, I think really well, it is a recognition that there can be a real learning from the other, and there can be things in the, what did we say earlier, the toolbox of tradition that have gotten dusty and haven't been used. But if Catholic is universal, then all the truth is Catholic truth, not in the sense that it's, my way, Roman right, Latin West. That's not what I mean at all. But it is universal Christian truth that is our birthright as baptized Christians. And this is what, and like a great example of this is Ratzinger and Congar and all these guys who are interested in this question of one sources and two sources and material sufficiency and all this kind of stuff. Is they're not repudiating the Council of Trent, but they're going back to a fork in the road, and they're saying there's other stuff in the tradition that allows us to emphasize this and to face forward in this direction. And I think that's what responsible reform on these theological matters. I think something like religious liberty is different because you're talking about policies and church and state. And I think all that is historically situated. But on this question of revelation, how do we think about revelation? I think what you describe is absolutely right.
Excellent. Okay. Let's see. We have a few questions in the chat.
Sure.
Okay. So let's start with this one right here. Why would it be viewed as enlightenment? Let's see. I'm sorry. I'm trying to read. Would we argue that it's a misnomer in many regards? Okay, so this person is saying that the word enlightenment is a misnomer. I think because they're assuming its antithetical nature. But the question continues: what was the main essential reason the Jesuits were suppressed? Is it because they became too powerful and successful? So that's two questions there, Shaun.
Okay, I'll go with the second one first.
Okay.
The main essential reason the Jesuits were suppressed is because very powerful Catholic governments and enemies of the Jesuits saw the Jesuits as both symbols and as agents of a form of Catholicism that they wanted to defeat. So there's a lot of, all the stuff we've been talking about. Ultramontanism is probably the most important. The view of divine grace, the moral teaching. But from the political perspective, it was seen as a group within a state is too strong, but it was seen as a group within the state that is not answerable to the state.
Gotcha.
So that's how you get a guy like Pombal in Portugal interested. Whereas if Jansenists were whispering, oh, they believe blah, 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 I don't think Pombal really cared about De Auxiliis and Unigenitus, but he cared a lot about how authority worked in the Portuguese Empire. And he didn't want there to be a group there that answered to a general in Rome and the Pope over the head of the king or the Archbishop of Lisbon or whoever it might be.
Gotcha.
I hope that. And then the first one, well, the Enlightenment one, I mean, that's just sort of, in my opinion, that's just a polemic.
Semantic.
I mean, fine. Everyone has a right to their own opinion about the Enlightenment, but
I see.
Enlightenment, you can acknowledge the historical reality of Catholic engagement with the Enlightenment, and you can say it's bad. Plenty of people have done that. I mean, when Sebastian Markel came up with this term Katholische Aufklärung, one of the most prominent German Catholic historians attacked him and said, this is ridiculous. This was all bad. I don't think that is where the vast majority of Catholic scholars would be at today. But you have a right to your opinion, of course. And I mean, plenty of people in the history of the church would agree with you.
Fair enough.
The Enlightenment's terrible.
Excellent.
Right, what's the next one? Let's see.
This is a great one here. Question for Dr. Blanchard. Any recommended books and resources on 17th, 18th century Augustinianism of the kind of Cardinal Henry Norris, Fulgentius Bellelli, and John Lawrence Berti?
That's a nice Anglicization of Gian Lorenzo. Yeah, John Lawrence. That's his name. That's right. That's a great question. So let me see what if I have. You know what? The best thing for me to do would be today or tomorrow. Probably tomorrow. I'll get on this stream and I'll type some stuff out. But there's a great history of Italian Jansenism by a guy named Pietro Stella, and who passed away recently. He was brilliant. He was from the Don Bosco Fathers. I can't remember the name of the order. Salesians of Don Bosco.
Salesians,
And brilliant Italian historian. But he wrote a 3-part history of Italian Jansenism. But volume 1 is really about Italians who are trying to be Augustinians but not Jansenists. So he goes into some good detail on all 3 of these figures. There are specific academic articles about each of these figures. And honestly, with Google Books and archive.org, you might even be able to find their actual primary sources. So I'll send you some stuff. And if you look in the footnotes, if you read, I presume most of what they wrote was Latin. They probably wrote some in Italian. Then you could read them yourself.
Excellent. Well, is there anything else you wanted to add, Dr. Blanchard, before we?
I don't think. Oh, I would just say one thing, which I was thinking about saying at the beginning. The 3 most important events in church history in the 18th century, at least from a European perspective: Unigenitus in 1713, suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, and French Revolution in 1789, or civil constitution, or however we want to do that. And all 3 of them are linked in kind of a really interesting way. So studying any of those events can sort of lead you in a horizon backwards in history or forwards in history in kind of a really cool way. Because the story of the Jesuits, of course, continues. It continues. They're extremely important in the First Vatican Council.
Yeah.
They're extremely important in the pastoral life of the UK, of the United States, and globally. I mean, when I go places, I meet Indian Jesuits, I meet Nigerian Jesuits, I meet Filipino Jesuits. So studying the Jesuit order, whether you love them or hate them or somewhere in between, is a really cool window into like the development of Catholicism, global Catholicism. Of course, we have a Jesuit Pope now. So the Jesuit order is fascinating to study. And I kind of have, it's funny because, I study Jansenism as one of the primary things I study. So I was educated by Jesuits at Marquette University, and then I study their arch enemies. But that's a very kind of Jesuit thing to do, because they're always surprising and I don't know, confounding. Whatever you think of them, they're not boring. I'll put it that way. So, but that's all from me, Dom. I really enjoyed it.
Same.
And I think you're really right on about your reading of Reform and Ressourcement. That stuff is also just, I could just read that for the rest of my life. That stuff is just so beautiful.
Yeah, no, I agree. Excellent. Well, Shaun, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Another great conversation. Audience, make sure you like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment down below. As usual, keep it civil. And if you enjoy these conversations, consider supporting us at patreon.com/The Logos Project. And so without further ado, we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.